When I started working as a food delivery guy, I figured it would be a pretty straightforward job. Pick up food, drop it off, maybe get a tip if I was lucky. I'd been doing it for a few months, and nothing too weird had happened until last week. It was a regular night, the kind where everything blends together. I had just finished a delivery in a quiet neighborhood when a new order popped up on my app. The address was in a part of a town I didn't recognize, but the map showed it was only about 15 minutes away. I accepted the order and headed to the restaurant. The pickup was normal. The staff handed me a brown paper bag filled with some kind of soup. The name on the order was Mr. Sullivan. I glanced at the address again and noticed that it was on a street I hadn't been to before. It wasn't too far, but the area was kind of isolated. There were no street lights, and the houses were spaced far apart. I drove down the main road and eventually turned onto a narrow, winding street. The trees on either side were thick, almost like a tunnel. My GPS told me I was getting close, but the road was getting darker and more uneven. I figured it was just a rural area, maybe an old house at the end of a dead-end street. When I arrived at the address, I was surprised to see an old, dilapidated house. It looked like no one had lived there for years. The windows were dark, and the paint was peeling off in large chunks. The yard was overgrown, with weeds taller than the mailbox. The house didn't seem like the kind of place someone would order food from. But the address matched, so I got out of the car. I walked up to the front door, the bag in hand. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A small, dim light flickered inside. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just leave the food on the doorstep, but something made me knock. The sound of my knuckles against the old wood seemed to echo through the empty house. I waited, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave the bag on the porch, I heard a faint shuffling noise from inside. It sounded like someone was moving, slowly, toward the door. "Mr. Sullivan," I called out. My voice seemed too loud in the stillness. There was no response, but the shuffling grew louder. It was close now, right on the other side of the door. I took a step back, suddenly feeling uneasy. The door creaked open just a few inches, and I caught a glimpse of something inside. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a figure standing in the shadows. I held out the bag. "Your food's here." The figure didn't move. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. The smell of damp wood and rot wafted out from the house. After a long pause, a hand slowly reached out from the darkness. It was thin, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over the bones. The fingers were long, too long, and they trembled as they reached for the bag. I froze, unable to look away. The hand grabbed the bag, pulling it into the darkness. I didn't see the person's face, but I felt their eyes on me. The door creaked open a little wider, and for a split second I thought I saw something move behind the figure. Something else, something low to the ground. My heart was racing. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt like they were glued to the porch. Then, in a low, raspy voice, the figure spoke. "Thank you for the delivery." It wasn't the words that scared me. It was the way they were said, slow, deliberate, like they hadn't spoken in years. The door began to close, but before it did, I heard a faint whisper from inside the house. It was so quiet I almost missed it. "Come back." The door clicked shut, and I was left standing on the porch, staring at the old, rotting wood. The house was silent again. The uneasy feeling in my gut was now full-blown fear. I turned and practically ran back to my car. As I got in and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. I didn't take any more orders that night. I went home and tried to forget about the whole thing, but I couldn't. The next day, out of curiosity, I looked up the address. There was no Mr. Sullivan listed as living there. In fact, the house had been abandoned for years. The last resident was an elderly man who had died nearly a decade ago. The place had been empty ever since. I haven't been back to that part of the town since, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I think about that old house, about the figure in the doorway, about the whisper, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had gone back. It was one of those nights when the city felt alive. People were out, the streets were buzzing, and I was in the middle of my shift, delivering food all over town. I'd been doing this gig for a while, and by now, I had seen all kinds of things. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I got an order from a high-end Italian place downtown, the kind where even the takeout costs a small fortune. The address was on the outskirts of the city, in a newer development that was still half under construction. I didn't think much of it. People with money liked their privacy, and I figured this was just another one of those big fancy houses. The drive took about 25 minutes. The closer I got, the fewer streetlights there were. By the time I reached the development, it was practically pitch black. The houses were huge, but most of them looked empty. No lights, no cars in the driveways. Just dark, towering structures against the night sky. I finally reached the address. It was a massive, modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows, but something was off. The place was completely dark, no lights on inside, no sign of life. I double-checked the address on the app, and it matched. I figured maybe the owner was out, and they'd left a light on inside that I couldn't see from the outside. I parked in the driveway, grabbed the bag of food, and walked up to the front door. There was no doorbell, just a sleek intercom panel. I pressed the button, and a few seconds later, the screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, black and white image of the doorway. My own reflection stared back at me. I couldn't see inside the house at all. I waited, but no one answered. I pressed the button again, and this time, a voice crackled through the speaker. It was a man's voice, but it sounded distant, almost like it was coming from far away. "Leave it by the door," the voice said. "Sure thing," I replied. "But I need a signature." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Come inside." That was against company policy. We were never supposed to go inside a customer's house. But something about the voice made me hesitate. It didn't sound right, like there was something wrong with the person on the other end. Before I could decide what to do, the door clicked open on its own. I stood there, staring into the dark entrance. A part of me wanted to just leave the food on the doorstep and get out of there. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the oddness of the situation. I don't know. But I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft thud, and I was enveloped in darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The interior of the house was as sleek and modern as the outside, but it was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing, just bare walls and floors. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I took a few steps forward, shining my light around. The place looked like it had just been built, but there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. No footprints in the dust, no personal belongings, just emptiness. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. There was a staircase leading down, almost hidden in the shadows. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from below. Against my better judgment, I started down the stairs, the light from my phone barely cutting through the darkness. The basement was unfinished, with exposed concrete walls and pipes running along the ceiling. The light was coming from a single, bare bulb hanging from the center of the room. And in the middle of the floor, surrounded by more darkness, was a table. On the table, there was a laptop, its screen glowing faintly. I approached cautiously. The laptop was open, showing a video feed. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was the front door, the exact spot where I had been standing just moments ago. The camera was hidden somewhere outside. Watching anyone who approached the house, I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been watching me the whole time, but who and why? Suddenly, the video feed changed. It switched to a different angle, showing a dimly lit room, a small, windowless space with concrete walls. In the center of the room was a chair, and in the chair sat a man, tied up and gagged. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was struggling against his restraints. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else. The only sound was the faint hum of the laptop and the man's muffled cries from the video feed. Then, the voice from the intercom spoke again, this time from the laptop speakers.
"You're going to take his place."
Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted up the stairs, not caring about the noise I was making. I sprinted for the front door, but when I reached it, it was locked. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, hoping to call for help. But when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. The app was open, displaying a new order. The address was the same as the one I was standing in, but the name had changed. Now it read, "Your name." My blood ran cold. I turned back to the laptop, the only light in the darkened house. The video feed was still playing, showing the man in the chair. But now, his eyes were locked on the camera, and I realized he was staring directly at me. His muffled screams grew louder, more frantic. I had to get out. I didn't care about the door anymore. I ran to the nearest window and tried to break it, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was reinforced, designed to keep people in. My breathing grew ragged, fear clouding my thoughts. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls shrinking, the shadows deepening. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. They echoed through the empty house, growing closer with each passing second. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and ran deeper into the house, searching for another way out. But every door I tried was locked, every window sealed. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel someone's presence, feel their breath on the back of my neck. My mind was racing, my body moving on instinct. I turned down a hallway and found myself in a small room with no other exits. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped at the doorway. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel them standing there, watching me, just like they had been watching the whole time. And then, the voice spoke again, this time, right next to my ear. "You shouldn't have come inside." The lights went out, plunging the room into total darkness. And the last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the door clicking shut, locking me in.
It was a rainy night, the kind where the streets glisten under the streetlights and everything feels damp and cold. I was working another shift as a food delivery driver, trying to make some extra cash. The orders were slow that night, but I finally got a ping for a delivery in a part of town I didn't usually go to. It was a small, older neighborhood, tucked away behind a series of winding roads. The order was from a late-night diner, one of those places that serves greasy comfort food around the clock. The kind of food people crave when they're up too late or can't sleep. I picked up the order, a couple of burgers and fries, and headed out. The drive took about 20 minutes, and by the time I reached the neighborhood, the rain had picked up. The houses were all dark, except for the occasional porch light. The address led me to an old house at the end of a narrow dead-end street. It was one of those homes that had probably been nice once but had seen better days. The paint was peeling and the yard was overgrown. I parked in front and grabbed the food. The house was quiet and there were no lights on inside, just the faint glow of a porch light struggling to stay lit. I walked up to the door and knocked, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping up on me. For a minute, there was no response. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching the door. The sound was slow, like someone dragging their feet. The door opened a crack, and a man peered out. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with unkempt gray hair and tired eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days.
"Your food's here,"
I said, trying to keep my tone casual. The man just stared at me for a moment before opening the door wider. I handed him the bag, and he took it without saying a word. I was about to turn and leave when he finally spoke.
"Wait."
He said, his voice rough and hoarse. "Can you help me with something?" I hesitated. It was late, and I still had a few more deliveries to make. But the way he asked, it wasn't desperate, just tired, like he didn't have anyone else to ask. Against my better judgment, I nodded.
"What do you need?"
He gestured for me to follow him inside. I stepped in, the air inside heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. The house was cluttered, but not dirty, just filled with stuff, old furniture, books, boxes. It looked like the kind of place where someone had lived for decades, collecting things over the years and never throwing anything away. He led me to a small living room at the back of the house. The light from the kitchen barely reached here, and I could see the flicker of a TV screen in the corner, casting a dim blue glow. The man pointed to an old recliner near the TV.
"I can't lift this by myself,"
he said.
"Need to move it out of the way. The power's been acting up, and I need to get to the fuse box behind it."
I nodded and set my phone down on a nearby table. Together, we pushed the recliner out of the way. It was heavier than it looked, and the man strained to help. His breathing labored. When we finally got it moved, he sighed in relief.
"Thanks,"
he said.
"I don't get many visitors. My son used to help me with this kind of thing, but he hasn't been around much lately."
There was something in his voice, a sadness, a loneliness that I hadn't noticed before. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. The man shuffled over to the fuse box and opened it, flipping a few switches. The lights flickered for a moment before coming back on, a little brighter this time. "There," he said, more to himself than to me.
"That should hold for a while."
He turned back to me, and for a moment, we just stood there in the dim light, the sound of the rain pattering against the windows. I felt a strange sense of connection to this stranger, like I had stepped into his world for just a brief moment. "Thank you," he said again, this time with more warmth.
"It's hard getting old."
I nodded, unsure of what to say. I grabbed my phone and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, the man spoke up one last time.
"Be careful out there,"
he said.
"This neighborhood isn't what it used to be."
I gave him a small smile and stepped back out into the rain. As I walked back to my car, I glanced around the quiet street. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just dark houses and the sound of rain hitting the pavement. I got into my car, turned on the engine, and drove away. But as I made my way back to the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a lingering unease. Maybe it was the man's words, or maybe it was the strange quietness of the neighborhood. When I got back to my route, I finished the rest of my deliveries without any trouble. But that night, After my shift ended and I was lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about that old house and the man living in it. The way he had looked at me, like I was the first person he'd seen in a long time. The loneliness in his voice. I decided to look up the address the next day, just out of curiosity. What I found wasn't shocking, but it made everything make sense. The house had been put up for sale a few months back after the owner, a man in his late 60s, had passed away. The listing was still online, showing pictures of the house exactly as I remembered it, down to the old recliner in the living room. But the part that really got to me was the note in the listing. It mentioned that the owner had lived alone for years after his son had moved away, rarely having visitors, and that the house had been on the market, unsold, for months. The realization hit me hard. The man I had met wasn't supposed to be there, but he had been. And I had helped him, if only for a moment. The next time I drove by that neighborhood, the house was dark again. No lights, no sign of life. Just another empty, forgotten home at the end of a quiet street.